Hello, Daisy Cakes. I've reacted to lists of top science fiction novels before, but I've never really created my own list. And I've tried coming up with the top 10 or top 20 or whatever. But like one of my subscribers said, "Hi Mary, whatever list I come up with today will change tomorrow." And that's so true. So then I decided to start listing my favorite sci-fi writers. And I easily came up with 50. But I could keep going. So that's what I did. And now I've compiled a list of the top 100 science fiction writers according to me, Daisy Ex Machina, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Okay, this is really annoying me, so I'll take it off. Hold the presses! Did I just say 100 science fiction authors? Well, yes. Yes, I did. And I didn't stop there. I made up a list of 100 fantasy authors, and I know a lot of them write both science fiction and fantasy because it's all speculative, but I didn't want any duplication, so I just placed an author that did both in either science fiction or fantasy based on where my favorite work ended up being. And I wanted to make sure I had modern authors as well as classic authors. I even included some juvenile and young adult authors. Now, there's no way I'm going to sit here and do a 5-hour video listing 100 authors. So the plan is to release the authors in alphabetical order, starting with the first 10, so in groups of 10. Now, I read a lot of science fiction in the 70s and 80s because there just wasn't that much fantasy back then. Seriously, you'd go to a Walden Books back in the 70s and there was only the science fiction section. It wasn't called science fiction and fantasy, just science fiction. There was some fantasy mixed in with it, but honestly, 90% of the books were science fiction. But after Sword of Shannara and Lord Fell's Bane, you gradually began to see more and more fantasy, but it wasn't until the 90s that the tide seemed to have turned, and there now seems to be more fantasy than science fiction. We'll see if a tide ever turns back, but I want to know what your history is with science fiction. Let me know down in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. After all, you don't want to miss the rest of this list of 100 must-read science fiction authors. So what are we waiting for? Let's get started. Ready, get set, go. First in the list is Douglas Adams. Adams is an English author born in 1952 and unfortunately died at the very young age of 49. And did you know he was in Monty Python's Flying Circus? Yes, he was discovered by Graham Chapman and had a couple of brief appearances in the fourth season and some writing credits. He discovered he was more of a writer than performer, and he went on to write for Doctor Who. But of course, he is most known for The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, published in 1980. This is a science fiction must-read, especially if you like the absurd, the satirical, and that really dry British humor. Personally, I think it is hilarious, but humor is subjective, so your mileage may vary. There are actually 6 books in the Hitchhiker series, but the last book, which I haven't read and I just heard about this, was written by Ian Colfer, who was a writer of the children's series Artemis Fowl, and apparently had permission from Adams' estate to write this 6th book. Anyway, my recommendation is really just for the first 3 books: Hitchhiker's Guide, Restaurant at the End of the Universe, and Life, the Universe, and Everything. He also wrote the Dirk Gently books, which are pretty good too, but start with the Hitchhiker's Guide to see if the humor is for you. Changing course, I have picked Thea Alexander, who is basically known for only one book, 2150 AD, published in 1971. Now, I read this as part of a study group back in the 90s, and I'll tell you right away, this is not a book for everyone. Some people will read it and find it way too woo-woo or new age or whatever. If you don't like that sort of thing, skip this book. But if you want to explore a utopian future or alternate spirituality, maybe pick this one up. It's about a man named John from 1976 who astrally travels to, you guessed it, 2150 AD. Anyway, I liked it a lot when I read it, and I know it's on many people's favorite book list. I like it on this list because it's just one of those one-hit wonders. I don't think the author ever wrote or published another work of fiction. It's a one-off, but it's had an interesting impact and history. The next author on the list is Charlie Jane Anders, who's also a trans activist, born in 1969 and has garnered many awards, including the Hugo, Nebula, and Lambda Literary. The Anders novel I read that blew me away and that I recommend is All the Birds in the Sky, published in 2016. Now, this could easily go into fantasy because it's kind of about fantasy versus science, the world of witches versus the world of mad scientists. Dare we say it's a metaphor between the emotional versus the intellectual. It has an almost experimental literary bent to it. It's about Patricia, a girl who grows into a woman with the powers of a witch, and her friend Lawrence, the techno-geek boy who grows up into, well, let's just say a mad scientist. Are they enemies? Are they lovers? What is it? It's complicated, and a book you've got to check out. Now, of course, I had no plan to have two trans authors in a row, but alphabetical means alphabetical. And next up is Ryka Aoki, who wrote the amazing novel Light from Uncommon Stars in 2021. It was nominated for a Hugo and won the Otherwise Award, which was previously known as the James Tiptree Jr. Award. This one also maybe could go into fantasy, but it has spaceships, so let's put it in science fiction. The plot is crazy. It's about a young woman named Katrina Wynn, who is a violinist of exceptional skill who is also trans and suffers from an exceptional lack of self-worth. She becomes a student of the world's best violin teacher, Shizuka Satomi, who also happens to sell the souls of violinists to the devil in exchange for fame. Yes, I know, fantasy, but Shizuka falls in love with the local donut shop owner who happens to be an alien starship captain. Yes, the book is as nuts as it sounds, but it's brilliant. Ultimately, it's about Katrina's journey to self-discovery and self-empowerment. We're going to take another sharp turn and go really old school with Isaac Asimov. If you are into science fiction, you know who Asimov is. He was considered one of the big three science fiction writers of his day, along with Robert Heinlein and Arthur C. Clarke. He was born in 1920 in Russia and immigrated with his parents to New York in 1923. He was also one of the most prolific authors ever, publishing more than 500 books in a bunch of different genres, but of course, he is known for science fiction. The I, Robot book, which is a fix-up novel of short stories that first appeared in pulp magazines, was published in 1950 and is maybe the most influential book when it comes to robots or AI with the 3 laws of robotics. And then there is the Foundation books. The first one was published in 1951, which was also a fix-up novel, which introduced the concept of psychohistory, which challenged the concept that hard science fiction could maybe include the soft sciences. But my personal favorite Asimov novel is The Gods Themselves, published in 1972, which won the Hugo and Nebula. It's about first contact with aliens in a parallel universe and alternates between the human and alien point of view. And the story encompasses the wonderful quote, "Against stupidity, the gods themselves contend in vain." The next author you may not know of, but I think is brilliant, A. Attanasio, who wrote Radix, published in 1981. It's the first book in a series known as the Radix Tetrad. and that's 4 books. Radix was nominated for Nebula, but won the French literary award that I've never heard of called the Prix Cosmos. Anyway, he was big in France, which seems to happen when Americans don't understand something, and Radix is a hard one to wrap your mind around. It's set in the far, far, far future about a man who goes on maybe a hero's journey or epic odyssey and eventually becomes a demigod, kind of, maybe. Anyway, if you like mind benders, check out Radix. Now, let's jump to an author I think all of you know, Margaret Atwood, the Canadian writer born in 1939, who wrote The Handmaid's Tale, published in 1985. Now, I remember when this came out because I was an assistant manager at a bookstore, and it was always shelved in general fiction rather than science fiction. But obviously, it's science fiction, but it's one of those science fiction books that the gods of publishing deemed has written above that low-class science fiction genre. The same thing happened to Vonnegut's later works. Anyway, The Handmaid's Tale, which has recently been given a second life thanks to the amazing Hulu adaptation, is a cautionary tale about what could happen, specifically to women, if the United States is taken over by a hard-right, fundamental, ultra-religious party during a crisis when few babies can be born. Spoiler alert, it doesn't go so great for women. Anyway, it's a dystopian novel that hits many people, including me, maybe a little too close to home. Moving alphabetically from A's to B's, we find Paolo Bacigalupi, a science fiction writer I've only recently discovered a few years ago, though the book I read was published in 2009. I am talking about The Wind-Up Girl, his debut novel. It blew me away. Now, this has been termed biopunk, which I kind of like. It's set in Thailand in the 23rd century when global warming has made food production the number one commodity that mega corporations battle over, with ever-evolving forms of genetic modification to create calories. The main character isn't very likable, so it's a bit of an anti-hero story. He's Anderson Lake, the corporate spy from America trying to steal Thailand's seed bank. The eponymous wind-up girl is a minor side character named Miko at first, but she doesn't really come into her own until later in the novel. She's an artificial human, but still human, who is discarded from her owner and used as a sex worker or slave. This is a gritty, dark story, but somehow it isn't as depressing as I'm making it out. Certainly, this is an author to keep an eye on. One of my favorite science fiction authors is Iain Banks, and that's for the culture novels. Banks is a Scottish author who came to fame with a horror novel called The Wasp Factory. Now, I've read The Wasp Factory, and it's one of the creepiest stories I've ever read, and I usually don't like slasher horror, but that's what this one is, and let's just say it's different. But it has a ton of trigger warnings, so enter at your own risk. But for science fiction, I absolutely love the Culture series, which starts with Consider Phlebas, which was published in 1987. The Culture is a far future society described as a post-scarcity anarchist utopia. Now, how do humans find utopia? They basically give up control to artificial intelligence machines known as the minds. In Consider Phlebas, the Culture is at war with the Ideran Empire, and one of the minds is hiding out as a refugee on a world controlled by godlike beings who are incorporeal. The Ideran Empire is, of course, intent on capturing the mind and sends in an operative who is also a shapeshifter known as Horza. This is such a great first novel in the Culture books, and I should mention that we're calling it a series, but they really are standalone novels just set in the same universe. Unfortunately, Banks died in 2013 at the age of 59, but he has left behind a substantial number of works, including 10 Culture novels. Finally, For this video anyway, we're going to end with an oldie but a goodie, Alfred Bester, one of our authors from the golden age of science fiction. Harry Harrison, who we'll cover in a later video, but he said Alfred Bester was one of the handful of writers who invented modern science fiction. And who are we to disagree? Bester was born in 1913 and died in 1987. The work he is most known for, and one I recommend all science fiction fans should read, is The Demolished Man, published in 1953, though it was serialized before that in Galaxy Science Fiction. The Demolished Man is set in the future where telepathy is common, though telepaths have varying degrees of powers and the most powerful can dominate the weaker. Kind of reminds me of Scanners. The story starts with a rather elaborate murder involving a slightly insane corporate CEO, and then it turns into a police procedural led by a telepathic police detective. Oh, if you recognize the name Alfred Bester from Babylon 5, yes, they named one of the Psychor characters after the author. And another book I'll mention is one I remember being absolutely blown away with. It's one of the last books that Bester wrote, and I got it when it was first published in 1980, Golem 100. Has anyone read that besides me? You can't seem to find it anywhere, and it has gotten savage on Goodreads, so maybe my tastes were just weird when I was a teenager. I do remember it felt very experimental, especially towards the ending when they had text interspersed with cartoon drawings. Anyway, Alfred Bester, science fiction legend. So those are the first 10 in my list of the top 100 science fiction authors. Let me know if you agree whether or not these 10 should be on the list. Like I said, I'll also be doing a top 100 fantasy authors list, but this is going to be a slow-moving, ongoing project. I probably won't even finish it until the end of the year. So, until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.